In the cold expanse of Sector 89G, light-years beyond the Milky Way, the warning etched in ancient universal script hovered in the vacuum of space. Do not provoke the Terrans. It was old, older than the intergalactic assembly itself, written on a drifting obsidian monolith with language no known race had dared to erase. Most passed it off as ancient superstition. Others laughed. But the Xerelians, proud, dominant, and ruthless, decided to test the myth. Counselor Zine, leader of the Xerelian war faction, declared it during a broadcast across galactic frequencies. If humans were ever dangerous, they are now extinct or diluted. Let us finish what our ancestors should have long ago. There was no fear in his voice, only arrogance and amusement. He was from a race that had never known defeat. His ancestors had wiped out civilizations, one more forgotten species. He didn't even blink. Humanity by then had retreated. After centuries of war, betrayal, and exploitation by other races, they vanished from major trade hubs and military alliances. Their homeworld, Earth, was shielded and silent. No communication, no vessels, no diplomats, just silence. The galaxy assumed they'd grown tired, beaten, irrelevant. But beneath that silence, humanity waited. Commander Elise Hart of the Human Recon Fleet stood alone in a holographic war chamber buried beneath the Andes Mountains. She watched as Xerelian war fleets moved toward Earth's outer colonies. Small ones, uninhabited moons, research outposts, forgotten listening stations. Probes picked up the transmissions. Xerelian soldiers mocking Terran ghosts, desecrating ancient monuments, tearing down human emblems like souvenirs. Elise didn't flinch. She simply whispered into her neural interface, "Activate Lazarus Protocol." 1,000,000 AI nodes scattered across humanity's hidden networks blinked to life. You see, humans never forgot. After centuries of betrayal and marginalization by advanced alien coalitions, they realized diplomacy was just a tool for the powerful to delay conquest. They didn't vanish. They adapted. They decentralized. They became shadows in the systems, quiet, calculating, and obsessed with one purpose: deterrence. Meanwhile, the Xerelians struck. Their warships arrived at Mars Outpost Theta, an old station, broken antennas, dust-covered solar panels, deserted, or so they thought. As their foot soldiers landed, mocking the silence, the ground split open. Automated defense drones erupted. Not mere weapons, living war machines grown from synthetic flesh and quantum steel. They didn't aim to kill. They recorded, cataloged, analyzed. 30 minutes later, the station self-destructed. No survivors. But the real message was already traveling. The galaxy received a pinged data packet, footage of the ambush, clear audio of Xerelian soldiers screaming. A voice overlaid at the end, calm, emotionless, unmistakably human. "We asked for peace. You answered with provocation. Now, you will learn." Back in the intergalactic assembly, the reaction was chaos. Races that once thought humans were irrelevant scrambled to trace the message. Who sent it? Where was it from? How had humanity survived without trade, without alliances, without colonies? But none of them had realized. Humanity had stopped needing the galaxy. The Xerelians didn't retreat. Their pride was wounded. They launched a full invasion on Ganymede, another abandoned station. This time, they sent 5 fleets, dozens of cruisers, thousands of soldiers. What they found was worse than death. Now the galaxy waited, some terrified, others amused. But one question hung in the air like static in a failing signal. What happens when you provoke a species that has spent centuries preparing for revenge? The Xerelian fleet hovered over Ganymede with all the arrogance of a predator in familiar territory. Commander Carvox, appointed by Counselor Zine himself, stared at the lifeless surface of the icy moon, and scoffed. This is what they fear: frozen rock and obsolete tech? He waved his hand, and thousands of troops descended in drop pods, thunderous impacts shaking the ancient crust of Ganymede. The structures they landed near were rusted, dormant, silent. It looked like a place forgotten by time. No weapons, no resistance, until they opened the doors. The first team entered the central facility, an old mining and research hub built a century ago by Terran engineers. The walls were still etched with human graffiti, crude jokes, and murals of the Earth they had left behind. The squad laughed. One soldier carved an Shirelian insignia into the wall with his plasma blade. The laughter stopped when the door behind them slammed shut, and all communications went dark. Inside, the air thickened. Lights flickered. A humming began, a low pulsating sound that touched the base of the soldiers' skulls. Then the whispering started. Not in a language, not even a sound. A thought, a feeling. You shouldn't be here. Then the walls came alive. What the Xerelians didn't know was that Ganymede hadn't been abandoned. It had been repurposed. It wasn't a station anymore. It was a trap, a psychological weapon of humanity's own design, a fusion of AI, biochemical manipulation, and neural infiltration. No bullets, no plasma, just terror so pure it rewired the invader's brain. Outside, Commander Carvox watched as each squad's signal blinked out one by one. He tried to override the system. Nothing responded. The Ganymede station, though primitive-looking, had lured them in like a beast pretending to be dead. Then came the broadcast. Across all Xerelian military channels, video footage of their soldiers tearing at their own skin, screaming about shadows in their heads, eyes going black as if something ancient had infected their minds. A final message played over it. Elise Hart again, voice low, devoid of hatred, but filled with a terrifying certainty. You entered our mind space, our memories. You wanted a war. Now you're inside one. The Intergalactic Assembly scrambled to issue a recall to all Xerelian forces. Too late. Ganymede went dark. The entire fleet was lost. Over 90,000 Xerelian lives. Gone. The universe held its breath. Back on Earth, hidden deep within what looked like a derelict village in Siberia, Elise watched it all unfold. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply turned to her AI assistant, Solace, and said, "Initiate Phase 2. They'll come for us now." Phase 2 wasn't an attack. It was worse. One by one, across the galaxy, Xerelian-controlled systems began to collapse. Infrastructure failed. Credits froze. Entire AI systems locked them out. How? Humanity had left a digital ghost in every single system they'd ever touched during their days in the galactic network. Dormant viruses, neural keys, command nodes buried deep in code. The Xerelians had copied their tech, yes, but they'd also copied the trap. On a warship orbiting their capital, Counselor Zine stared at the collapsing market systems. "Impossible," he muttered. How did they do this? Then came the final warning, a short, cold message from Terran Command. You were warned. The council chamber fell silent. The war, they now realized, wasn't just about ships and guns. It was about survival in a world where humans had evolved into something no one had planned for. Monsters of memory, gods of paranoia, architects of perfect revenge. And they were just getting started. The Xerelian homeworld, Juraxis Prime, pulsed with tension. The sprawling metropolis that once symbolized invincibility now stood paralyzed. No power in the outer districts, no contact with key colonies, and the financial grid locked down tighter than a neutron vault. For the first time in their proud, brutal history, the Xerelians tasted vulnerability. Counselor Zine sat at the apex of the Tower of Judgment, flanked by his advisors. The atmosphere was suffocating. What troubled him wasn't just the military losses or the crumbling economy. It was the silence. Humanity hadn't followed up with threats or demands. There were no ultimatums, no negotiations, just silence. Zine slammed his fist against the obsidian table. "Where are they? What do they want?" One of his tech ministers, pale and shaking, answered, We don't know, Counselor. We can't trace their movements. They're not using standard warp lanes. They're off-grid, completely." "They're ghosts," muttered General Vokai, head of ground forces. "And ghosts don't fight fair." That's when it started. The first Terran ghost ship appeared on the outskirts of the Zinthar system. A Zarelian industrial hub. No official declaration. No open fire. It drifted silently into orbit, invisible to standard scanners until it activated an ancient frequency, long thought obsolete. A lullaby. A Terran song. Gentle. Childlike. But encoded within it was a virus. The planet's defense systems turned inward. Orbiting satellites fell from the sky, and just as quietly as it arrived, the ghost ship vanished. No casualties, no confrontation, just paralysis and shame. It happened again in the Vale sector. Then the Haraxis Ring. Ghost ships, stealth tech decades ahead of anything seen before, hitting supply chains, disrupting communications, collapsing starports. The Terrans weren't attacking in the traditional sense. They were infecting the Empire like a slow poison. Back on Earth, Elise Hart stood with a new figure, a man with tired eyes, a cybernetic arm, and a scar across his throat. Admiral Rourke. He had led the last official war the Terrans fought before retreating from galactic affairs. He had lost half his body, and his faith. Now he stood beside Elise in what looked like a moss-covered ruin in the Amazon, but was in fact a control hub buried deep beneath. "You still believe in restraint?" he asked, watching as more Cyrelian systems fell like dominoes. "No," she replied, "but I believe in precision. We make them feel what we felt. Then we decide if they're worth saving." Meanwhile, the galaxy began to shift. Races that had once mocked humanity started whispering about them with reverence and fear. Some began sending probes toward Earth's outer systems, not to spy, but to offer aid. Apologies, treaties, none returned. The Assembly called an emergency session. The term Terran contingency was spoken for the first time in centuries. The Zarelians demanded collective military retaliation. Others declined. Cowards? Maybe. Or maybe they understood what the Zarelians didn't. This wasn't a war. This was a reckoning. In a small resistance meeting in a border colony, a Zarelian engineer named Kathir played forbidden footage he'd acquired. A single Terran operative, unarmed, walking through a facility. Zarelian guards dropped their weapons mid-aim, not because of fear, because they couldn't move. Neural override. One look from the operative's augmented eyes, and they were paralyzed. He whispered the words like prayer. They've become myth. They don't need armies anymore. Back in the shadows of Earth, Elise looked at the stars with something close to sorrow. "They never understood," she said to Rourke. "We didn't want revenge. We wanted respect. Now they'll get neither." He nodded grimly. "And when they beg for peace." Her answer was as cold as the void. "Then we show them what silence really means." Jaraxxus Prime was no longer the jewel of the galaxy. It had become a mirror of fear. Streets once brimming with military parades now echoed with whispers. Civilians dared not speak the word Terran aloud. Entire districts were under martial law, not from invasion, but from paranoia. The enemy wasn't seen, only felt, like a predator brushing against your soul before striking. Counselor Zine had grown hollow. His crimson robes hung loose around him, his once commanding voice cracked. He hadn't slept in days. The nightmares were worse than any intelligence report. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Earth, not as it was, but as it had become, veiled in shadows, guarded by machines with human hearts and human vengeance. The latest horror arrived not by ship, but by whisper. Across the Xerelian military ranks, high-ranking officers began to vanish. No alarms, no blood, just absence. Rooms untouched, uniforms left behind. In one case, a general's skin was found draped neatly over his chair, his organs missing, but nothing else disturbed. "Psychological warfare," muttered General Vokai, his eyes twitching as he lit a trembling stick of Naraka root. Or something else. The galaxy watched, not with pity, but terror. The Dral Imperium sealed its borders. The Archeans began dismantling trade lanes once shared with the Xerelians. No one wanted to be next. On the Terran side, a new protocol had been activated. Echo Class Directive. It wasn't about direct engagement anymore. Terran operatives, altered humans called Echoes, were seeded across Xerelian systems. Genetically tuned to be invisible to bioscanners, capable of neural camouflage, and trained from birth for only one purpose: infiltration. One of them, Echo 11, sat inside a Xerelian databank control tower disguised as a low-level clerk. He was soft-spoken, diligent, invisible. For weeks he logged in, processed requests, and smiled politely. Until the signal came. He stood from his desk, walked to the central command node, and said 3 words in an extinct human dialect. The system obeyed. Xerelian fleet archives, troop deployments, weapon schematics. Deleted. Not stolen. Erased from existence. Backup nodes self-immolated. The digital memory of a galactic superpower blinked out like it had never been. And Echo 11 vanished. Panic turned into collapse. With no operational data, the Xerelians couldn't even locate their own ships, let alone defend their borders. Small rebellions erupted across outer colonies. Prisoners broke free. Warlords began carving up territory. The Empire was eating itself alive. Back on Earth, in a chamber surrounded by living walls of carbon-intelligent moss, Elise Hart received the final report. No response from their central command, Solace said. Civil structure failing. Uprisings confirmed on 8 systems. No organized resistance remains. Rourke stared at the data. They're broken. No, Elise corrected. They're empty. She turned to a panel and activated a holographic feed. Not of war, of old Earth footage. Children playing in parks, families gathered at beaches, cities glowing with culture and life. The image hovered like a ghost. "This," she said, "is what they destroyed when they called us savages. When they stole our colonies, erased our history, and mocked our resistance. This is what we became to survive." Rourke's voice was heavy. "And now?" Elise closed the feed. Her eyes hardened. "Now we decide if they deserve to exist." Back on Juraxis Prime, Counselor Zine received a package. No signature, no origin. Inside was a single item, a shard of Terran steel, etched with ancient human scripture. A message, burned into the metal. "This is mercy. Next time, we remember." He dropped it, hands shaking, knowing, finally, fully, that the war was never about domination. It was about memory, and humanity never forgot. The once glorious banners of the Xerelian Empire now hung tattered and faded, flapping weakly in artificial winds generated by failing environmental systems. On Juraxis Prime, power outages rolled across the capital like a sickness. The once immaculate skyline flickered in and out, sections going dark for hours, days. Starvation crept into the wealthiest districts. Order crumbled into desperate routine. Counselor Zine had not spoken publicly in 3 weeks. His last message, an erratic plea for unity, had been hijacked by Terran code before it aired. The broadcast replaced his speech with footage of a Terran child holding a charred Cerealian soldier's helmet. No voice, just the sound of wind and distant thunder. Inside the Tower of Judgment, Zine stood alone, gaunt and pale, staring at the endless holographic reports of collapse, factories seized by mobs, governors executed by their own people, loyalist fleets deserting their posts. He clutched the shard of Terran steel in his trembling hands. It had become his obsession. He whispered to it like it might answer. "Why did you come back? Why now?" But the answer had already been given. In the darkness of deep space, a silent armada approached, not vast in size, but terrifying in silence. No transmissions, no lights, no known power signature, just black angular ships, invisible to most sensors, gliding toward the remnants of Zerelian dominion. It was humanity's final movement. Each ship bore a singular symbol, 3 vertical scars slashed into a crimson ring. No names, no flags, just that symbol, burned into memory and history. The Judicator fleet, once myth, now fact. Built during humanity's silent exile, it had only one directive: engage only when every other lesson failed. The first planet targeted was Kalar Prime, once a major Cerealian military world, now ruled by rogue generals. As Terran ships descended, there were no warnings, no demands, just precision. Gravity wells collapsed. Fusion cores ignited in precise sequence. Entire facilities vanished without disturbing neighboring cities. Not a single civilian casualty. The message was surgical. We are capable of mercy, but we do not hesitate. Back in the assembly, what few member races remained were terrified. Emergency envoys were dispatched to Earth, offering alliances, reparations, even public apologies. None received a reply. Human space remained closed, blocked, watching. A desperate move came next. A neutral mediator, Ambassador Rix of the Vorilan Republic, risked his own life to approach Elise Hart on an unauthorized diplomatic shuttle. She allowed him to land. Inside a garden that defied every image of a warlike Earth, lush, vibrant, teeming with animal life, he bowed deeply before her. We understand now," he said softly. "Please. There are innocents within the Cerealian worlds, families, children. They do not stand with their empire." Elise nodded. Her voice, quiet but heavy, responded. "So did we." She handed him a data crystal. "Take this. A list of systems that will be spared. All others are deemed complicit." Rix took it with shaking hands. Spared from what? She looked him in the eye with the calm of a force long held back. Extinction. Back on Jaraxxus Prime, alarms blared. The sky split open. The Terran Armada had arrived, not to negotiate, not to warn, but to end. But it wasn't a bombardment. Instead, they released a signal, low, ancient, and undeniable. A memory. The full archive of every war crime the Zerelians ever committed against humanity. Each atrocity, each betrayal, each child killed, each colony erased. The memory burned across the sky. Civilians collapsed in the streets. Soldiers dropped their weapons. Some screamed, others wept. And a few, just a few, finally understood. This was never about humans being dangerous. It was about them being right. From orbit, the sight of Jaraxxus Prime was poetic in its cruelty. The once mighty heart of the Zerelian Empire now writhed beneath the slow, silent gaze of the Terran Judicator fleet. They didn't fire a single weapon. They didn't need to. The memory signal did far worse. The atmosphere of the planet was filled with echoes of screams. Not current, but historical. Real events pulled from archived neural memories of massacred humans. Soundscapes from the fall of Nova Eden. Video of children fleeing burning schools on Epsilon Ridge. The agonizing silence after the Omega Treaty betrayal. It played endlessly, looping across every frequency, every screen, every thought channel the Xerelians used. No one could look away. It was psychological exorcism, truth weaponized, and it broke them. Entire regiments laid down arms and turned on their commanding officers. Civilian mobs stormed local defense hubs, not to fight humanity, but to erase their own government. They wept in the streets, not for themselves, but for what they now remembered doing. The lies they believed, the blood they ignored. The memory of Terran suffering had infected their conscience, a virus made of guilt and unfiltered consequence. Counselor Zane could no longer speak. He was confined to his quarters, eyes open but seeing nothing, his hand still clutching that cursed Terran shard like it was a lifeline. He hadn't moved in 2 days. Medical staff whispered that his mind had collapsed. No drugs worked. He simply broke, and humanity still had not fired a shot. Across the galaxy, former allies of the Xerelians panicked. Some tried to denounce them, issue hasty apologies, build sudden monuments to Earth. Others enacted rapid purges of pro-Xerelian propaganda, declaring ignorance. It didn't matter. Humanity was watching, and they knew sincerity from survival instinct. Inside the Judicator command ship, Oblivion 7, Admiral Rourke stood before the War Council, a small circle of operatives and AI sentients. Elise Hart was among them, her expression colder now, distant, like she had moved past anger into something deeper. A place where mercy was calculated, not felt. The data leak worked, Rourke reported. But there's been a complication. Some Xerelian sectors are collapsing too fast. Lawlessness, mass suicides, panic riots. They're destroying themselves. Elise blinked slowly. Then our work is done. You're pulling back? He asked, startled. No, she said. We're observing. If they rebuild on truth, we step away. If they rebuild on denial, we return. Rourke paused. And if they beg for integration? For peace? She looked up. Her voice was quiet but sharp. Then we ask them to live with the same isolation they forced upon us. For 100 years. Elsewhere in the fleet, a transmission arrived from Kathir, the Xerelian engineer turned whistleblower. He had gone underground, helping resistance cells dismantle the last remnants of the military regime. His message was simple. There are still those who believe in redemption. Let us prove it. Elise considered it. Her silence lasted so long that even Solace, the AI, paused processing in anticipation. We watch, she finally said. But we do not forget. And with that, she issued the next order. Not an invasion. A broadcast. It echoed across the stars, translated into every known language. This is not conquest. This is consequence. Let it be known. Humanity was never lost. We were waiting, watching, and now, we remember. The galaxy stopped spinning, for just a moment, and in that moment they realized the truth. Humanity had not become monsters. They had become mirrors, and what the universe saw reflected back was its own cruelty, finally given form. In the smoldering remnants of the Xerelian capital, ash drifted through the skies like snow, soft, silent, almost peaceful. The great statues of conquest, once towering above cities, had been torn down by the hands of those who built them. The mighty banners of war were replaced with blank cloths, signaling surrender not just of military might, but of belief. But Earth's judgment didn't come in fire. It came in reflection. The Terran Judicator fleet remained motionless in orbit, a wall of silent eyes watching a species pick apart its sins. The planetary surface was a crucible now. Elise Hart and Admiral Rourke hadn't spoken in days. Observation was the current phase, witnessing, not intervening. And what they saw was complicated. In the industrial city of Varlock, something unexpected happened. Survivors, children of soldiers, laborers who had never set foot in space, began building a memorial. Not for Xerelians, for humans. They salvaged Terran symbols from old ruins and stories, carving them into stone with bare hands, bleeding into the work. One boy, no older than 10, painted the words, "I remember," in Terran script. He had never seen a human in his life. Elise watched the footage in silence. Her fingers traced the phrase again and again, as if trying to understand its weight. "They're beginning to see us," Rourke said softly. "Not as a threat, as history, and maybe as victims." "Too late," Elise muttered, but her voice lacked certainty. Elsewhere, on the Zarelian colony of Draxos IV, rebel factions were fighting against their own military remnants, not for power, but to force the full release of sealed war records detailing Terran atrocities. It wasn't just guilt anymore, it was accountability. They weren't running from their history, they were trying to drag it into the open. The Terran AI Solace offered new analysis. 53 Zarelian systems have begun independent reconciliation efforts. 14 have requested access to the memory archives. Elise's eyes narrowed. Do they think understanding us will earn forgiveness? Rourke tilted his head. Maybe they don't want forgiveness. Maybe they just want to change. The dilemma was real now. Humanity hadn't expected surrender in this form. They expected rebellion, denial, more blood. But what they got instead was submission tinged with sorrow, a strange wounded humility, and Earth didn't know what to do with it. The assembly, weakened and barely functional, requested an audience again, this time not to negotiate with Elise, but to submit to her judgment. An emergency envoy was granted access to Earth orbit. The speaker was Kathir, his face hollowed from months of resistance. "I do not come to bargain," he said, eyes locked on Elise's image across the neural relay. "I come to listen, and to ask, if not for peace, then for the permission to grieve, not for what we've lost, but for what we made you lose." Silence followed, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time, someone had said exactly what needed to be heard. Elise closed the connection. She said nothing to Rourke, nothing to Solace. She walked alone to the Garden of Silence, an underground sanctuary where she once buried every emotion that could betray her mission. She stood before a tree grown from Terran soil, watered by tears and time, and she whispered, "They're trying." For the first time since the war began, Elise's heart cried. The skies above Earth had never been so quiet, not because the Judicator fleet had left. They remained, suspended like obsidian ghosts, but because, for the first time in generations, humanity had stopped bracing for war. The signal from Elise Hart's command center went silent. No new directives, no new infiltrations, just pause. The galaxy waited. On Jaraxxus Prime, what was left of the Zarelian leadership convened, not in the Tower of Judgment, but in an open courtyard. There were no guards, no uniforms, just former commanders, ministers, teachers, and once silenced voices from across their shattered empire. They didn't argue. They listened. Kathir spoke for them. "We can't undo what was done, but we can ensure it is never forgotten, not in pride, in pain." From Earth, Elise watched, not with hope, but with curiosity. The rage in her veins had not cooled, but something else had taken its place. Responsibility. Humanity had become too powerful to be angry forever. Now they had to decide what kind of myth they wanted to leave behind. The Judicator fleet began transmitting again, not a threat, but a record. Every colony, every betrayal, every Terran life lost to Zarelian hands, not as revenge, as memory. And in return, something miraculous happened. The Zarelians responded with their own. They broadcasted the truth of their crimes, publicly, uncensored, across all channels, to every system still online. They named their monsters. They detailed every atrocity. No excuses, No embellishments. Galactic historian networks were the first to understand what was happening. A trade of trauma. A reckoning of species. The assembly slowly reconvened, this time without chambers of grandeur or pomp. They gathered on neutral ground, Lysera 9, a moon long abandoned during the Plague Wars. No guards, no fleets, just delegates and memory. Elise Hart stood before them, flanked by Admiral Rourke and Solace. A Zarelian child approached the center, holding a small relic, a broken, rusted nameplate from a Terran refugee ship lost a century ago. She placed it gently on the ground and bowed, not because she was ordered to, but because she understood. Elise knelt beside the child, placed her hand over the nameplate, and spoke to everyone listening. You saw us as lesser, primitive, dangerous. You beat us down, erased us from maps, tried to turn our stories into myths. She looked up, her voice calm, like a storm finally settling. But we remembered, and now, so will you. The Judicator fleet did not attack that day. Instead, they left, one by one, silent and cold, their black hulls blinking into warp space, not to retreat, to return home. And the galaxy, bruised, reeling, forever changed, finally breathed again. But no one forgot. Every planet, every race, every child born in the aftermath knew the truth, etched into memory like scars. Never provoke humanity. Not because they are monsters, but because when you make them ghosts, they will return as mirrors.